This is about my family and the extraordinary fact that we have 9 pilots in one family. And so I'll just quickly go through those, the family. So we start with me. I hope that's the last time I mention myself. My father, my uncle, his brother, my paternal grandfather, my maternal grandfather. By marriage, this man was married to my aunt, so he's an uncle by marriage. His father was a famous engineer, probably of knowledge to some of you here. My maternal great-grandfather was in the Royal Air Force, and my great-uncle was in the Royal Air Force. And then, for those of you canny enough to only count 8 pilots, there, our son, who is currently a Chinook pilot at RAF Odeon. And just to show you the extraordinary 9 pilots, the immediate are at the top, by marriage are underneath them, and to show we're not entirely RAF, because they weren't invented until 1918, we were in the Army and the Navy. Before that, probably the most distinguished one there being the man who was in charge at the siege of Lucknow. So let's start with my paternal grandfather, Air Commodore Ernest Howard-Williams, known for some reason which I can't find out why, as Bill. Flew with the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service in the First World War, and was a victim of Baron von Richthofen, shot down by him, obviously survived. During the early years of flying, you were lucky to survive your training and then into the First World War. My grandfather did, though not without mishaps. This is where a bullet at the end of its trajectory, presumably while he was flying, hit him with the compass around his neck. I have it at home, it's in my possession, that he was flying a Morris Farnborough. So, and when he was learning to fly, he was checking his instruments on one occasion, and when he saw suddenly kind of careering towards him another Farnborough which had landed downwind with a novice pilot who had misjudged the distance to land and went straight into him. Propellers thumping away, thwacking away. "For God's sake, someone turn his engine off," he screamed. And nobody did, because fuel, of course, was leaking everywhere. Fortunately, they did actually stop of its own accord, and they were both pulled out alive. There was also a genteel World War I custom, where if an airman was captured by the opposing Air Force, the airman would write a letter, a note, and the captured, the victorious Air Force would then get the captured pilot to write the note, wrap it up in a brick, and they would fly over his squadron base, waggle the wings to show that they had no ill intent, and drop the note on the airfield. And the captured pilot would explain what had happened. I have one of those notes. This is it. I particularly like the last sentence, really. "We were brought down on fire and hit the floor with a hell of a wang. Alan was killed," that was his observer, "when we hit. Goodbye, old thing. Give my love to everyone. Yours to a cinder, McTavish." Lieutenant Duncan McTavish. My father found the note when his father, my grandfather, had died, and decided to try and find his descendants, as my father was. Took him a long time. Took him about 7 years, because various departments in the War Office were not keen on sharing information, even in those days. But rather thrillingly, he found the descendants and the airman who had written the note. Lieutenant Duncan McTavish was still alive in 1976. My father couldn't resist it, flew over to Canada, where he now lived, and had this photograph taken. So that is my father and Lieutenant McTavish looking at the note that I've just, which is in my possession. Over 100 years later, of that note being written, I am in touch with McTavish's granddaughter and her husband. Won the Military Cross, and he was into the formation of the Royal Air Force almost as soon as it was formed. I think April the 1st, as we all know, which is not lost on the other services, April Fool's Day, and I think he was in by June or July. Between wars, he nearly kills his father. His father came to visit him at Beaulieu Airport, where he was training other pilots to fly, and they decided, as they could in those days, to go down to Bournemouth for lunch. They took a BE-2 up in the air, and somewhere over Christchurch, the camshaft broke in the engine, which required an immediate landing. He landed downwind, and at the end of the field, he found that to land in, there was a pond, a lake, after a lot of rain. And of course, the wheels dug in, the plane flipped over on its nose, and his father was left dangling by the seatbelts a few inches above the water. A few inches deeper, and his father would not have survived, because they both had to be pulled out by passing people. And this is a picture. That is the picture. I try not to think of this story when my son takes me flying in Cessnas and Pipers. He did go in, he was engine after, oh yes, this will interest you. After the First World War, he writes about this in his book. They were shrinking the Royal Air Force, and he didn't want to leave. So Trenchard advised him to go to university at the expense of the RAF and study engineering. So he went to Cambridge, Oxford, and London universities, all three, and got lots of degrees and all sorts of things. But of course, they then had a change of policy, and he didn't advance as far as he, and he thought others, thought he should have gone. And during the Second World War, he had a very boozy lunch with Trenchard, who he knew extremely well. And towards the end of the lunch, Trenchard, actually forgetting to whom he was talking, said, of course there's a policy in the Royal Air Force that we never let engineers get too senior a position because they will take your job. That was Trenchard. And arguably, of course, that could be said to have continued until last year, when for the first time, a non-pilot became Chief of the Air Staff. At the outbreak of World War II, however, he was number 2 to Dowding and clicked and rowed with him. He rowed with almost everybody who was senior to him. He claimed that he was right in a great many instances, and he enumerates in his book dive bombing, which he was a great proponent of, because he was able to drop 48 bombs out of 48 bombs in 1922 on the HMS Agamemnon, which was being used as target practice. So he said battleships, dive bombing, they should all be demolished and not used. And of course it didn't go down well with his senior commanders. He also had witnessed Mons and Passchendaele from the air. And he writes really movingly in his unpublished autobiography of this period of his life. And he claims that it coloured the rest of his life because he always questioned and queried the effectiveness of decisions versus the loss of life. He had seen the loss of life that was inflicted upon both sides for the advancement of 50 feet or so. So having round with Stuffy Dowding at Bentley Priory, he went to RAF Halton, where I was born some 30 years later, I'd like to say, but I can't. So a few years later, and round with his boss there, then went to Blackpool, which was an RAF training base, round with his boss there, and so ended the Second World War as air correspondent of the Daily Telegraph. And for 2 years, 2013 to 2015, the Daily Telegraph reprinted articles of the exact day 80 years previously. So I would wake up and have my breakfast reading an article by my grandfather in the Daily Telegraph. But there is an amazing fact between my two grandfathers, both in the Royal Air Force. First, my paternal grandfather fell out of his aeroplane at 500 feet. And we can hear him telling the story to my father now.
Now, how long after when RAF took you over was your business with the airplane till you went to the canal?
About a month afterwards, so it was probably 5, 6 years.
And what airplane was it?
Something short, and the pilot took me on a reconnaissance flight over port side, and unfortunately he did a flat turn, stalled, and got into the first stage of that flat spin, and then he tipped me out. And for force majeure, I came out and no parachute, nothing like that, but I had no parachute, of course, and I had a floating coat on a hard hat. So they saved me.
Where you go?
Well, I couldn't have taken the Suez Canal. But at the only time where the electric off the electric statue.
And you were picked out, you were really very quickly, and were you unconscious or?
I was very much conscious. When I came up under the crash, by then the pilot had come down, and I came up under the crash of the wrecked airplane, and had to go down again to get out of the swag. He was dead.
And you broke bones?
No. But I had tried to find out all my fingers cracked up from being shot.
My father went round interviewing, talking to people from that era. And he did some for the American Confederate Air Force. And I play one a little bit later on. You'll have to excuse him because he spells words he didn't think the Americans would know or understand. So you'll have to excuse that. But the amazing fact between the two grandfathers is that they both fell out of aeroplanes whilst they were flying. This was before they went on to meet their wives, subsequently having their children, and those children subsequently having me. So, and here is the article in the Mesopotamian Times. Okay, so he didn't fall out. He had engine problems, as they did so often in those days. And he had the choice of the Euphrates or some palm trees. He chose the Euphrates, and of course the wheels dug in, and he was observed to do a beautiful swallow dive, as again the aircraft tipped up on its nose. So on to him, my maternal grandfather, Air Vice Marshal F.F. Inglis. He came from a distinguished army background. As you can see there, he took over from his brother-in-law as director of RAF Intelligence and reported direct to Churchill. And in that capacity, he was sent by Churchill to persuade Roosevelt of the advantage of the policy that became known as Germany first. After Pearl Harbour, all the Americans wanted to do was to go after the Far East and sort out Japan over there. But Churchill reasoned that to defeat the Axis powers, you first had to cut off the head. And he saw the head as Adolf Hitler. So he went over to Roosevelt, stayed about a week in the White House and had 2 meetings with Roosevelt, who, against the advice of his own chiefs of staff, agreed with Churchill and started sending very quickly American troops over to the UK. So possibly my grandfather could be said to be responsible for the phrase, which was extremely popular at the time, over here, overpaid and oversexed. This was not, my grandfather was tied by the Official Secrets Act, and so he never ever discussed his wartime experience with anybody, nor did he write it down. But it was made mention in his obituary in the Times. So we know very little about what he did after that, except he was promoted and went to Singapore, where my mother and father met. My father was already posted there. He took his daughters over. Second daughter was my mother. And my father and mother met at the Changi Yacht Club in Singapore. Every time I conduct in Singapore, the first thing I say is, "Thank you, Singapore!" So let's go on to my great-uncle, Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard, who had 2 careers, one influenced by the other. The first, of course, was his flying career. He was in the Royal Naval Air Services and, of course, did reconnaissance flights over the Somme. But he also claims to have invented the word blimp. Now, the blimp was, of course, well known in the Second World War as it became the barrage balloon, and, of course, the famous cartoon character Colonel Blimp. But apparently, he claims he came up with the idea when he was walking past his airship, and he flipped, he flew airships in the First World War, and he flipped the envelope. And he turned to his crew and he said, "That sounds like blimp. It's going blimp." And the crew took it up, and shortly it was taken up by the rest of the Royal Naval Air Service. He transferred to the RAF, of course, along with everybody else, and in the position of Deputy Director in Intelligence in 1937, carried off a great coup. Pretending to be pro-Nazi, he entertained a group of politicians and senior servicemen from the Luftwaffe and Germany in particular to a tour round the UK. And remember, he pretended to be sympathetic to Germany. So much so that they agreed by the end of the tour that Germany and the UK would align and fight the upcoming conflict together. And for that reason, there was no need for Germany to build any four-engined bombers, and they never had any meaningful four-engine bombers in the Second World War. We had, and the reason for that is we had the Hastings, or we were about to have the Hastings, and of course the Lancaster was not too far behind, so Goddard said, you don't need four-engine bombers, we have them. After that, he was sent as the senior air advisor to Lord Gort with the BEF, British Expeditionary Force, which of course turned disastrous with the Blitzkrieg that the Germans did in 1940. Lord Gort could see what was happening, and he knew that all that was being proposed as a rescue attempt were 6 destroyers being sent to Dunkirk to take on 250,000 men, who by now had reached Dunkirk. So Lord Gort turned to Victor Goddard, and we know this from some books that he wrote. He turned to Victor Goddard and said, you have to get over to the cabinet war rooms in Whitehall and explain to them that we need more than 6 destroyers, otherwise we are going to have to surrender or fight to the death. There's going to be carnage, in other words. So Goddard, he got hold of a previously crashed Imperial Airways Ensign aeroplane that had taken some cargo over some support, some supplies to the BEF, and it had been friendly fired, brought down, and they repaired it all day, the engineer on the aircraft and the co-pilot, and at about midnight, the captain of the Imperial Airways said, okay, we can get this in the air, but we don't have a runway, we're in a field. So Goddard said, I'm going to park my staff car with its lights on in the lane over there, just beyond that hedge, aim for the headlights, and when you get to V1, let's hope it's before the hedge, rotate, and off we go. And that is effectively what happened. But they had no password to get into the UK. So they had to wait for dawn. And when dawn arrived, there was some discussion about whether to put navigation lights on. Would they look like a civilian aircraft? Would they look like paratroop aircraft? What would they look like? And I think they put their navigation lights on in case there were any night fighters about, on either side. And at dawn, they landed at Manston, refueled, and with a dog leg, because the aircraft was due back at Blackbush, with a dog leg to Northolt, they landed at Northolt, where Goddard commandeered a staff car, which took him to Whitehall. He couldn't get in. He couldn't get into the war rooms, and he only got past the first 2 security guards. The third wouldn't let him. He met a great friend, Air Commodore Archie Boyle, and looked at my great uncle, who said, you look a mess. Let's sharpen you up, and I'll get you into the briefings that are going on in the war rooms right now. Which he did. Got into the war rooms, and he arrived just in time to hear Admiral Pound, the Chief of the Navy, announce that it really was 6 destroyers and no more, no less. That's all he could do. There were some very senior army generals around that table, none of whom objected, as my great uncle thought they would. 6 destroyers to get, even if they'd done 6 journeys each without being bombed, they would only have been able to rescue something like 60,000 men. So he claims to have come up with the idea on the spur of the moment that they had to, he stood up and he shouted out, you have to send everything that can float, anything that can cross the channel, anything that can carry passengers has to be sent to Dunkirk, and not to the harbour, but to the beaches. Get those boats onto the beach, rescue the men and take them out to the destroyers. And at that point, Sir Richard Pearse, who was the Vice-Caz, was walking round the table. And he said, and the great uncle said, lifeboats, ferries, tugboats, private vessels, anything. And at that point, Sir Richard Pearse caught up with him and escorted him out as being overwrought. Upset, he wandered around Whitehall for a while until he decided to go and see a friend in the naval building. And he went into the office and the friend said to him, well, you've caused a bit of a stir. He said, I'm sorry, I just had to say something. There are 250,000 men there on the beaches at Dunkirk waiting for rescue. He said, yeah, we're going to go and get them. And his idea of the little ships, as we all know, was sent out to Ramsay to organise, Admiral Ramsay at Dover, to organise and send over. And in the end, I think it was 338,000 French, Belgian and British troops were rescued. Subsequent appointments saw him attain senior positions such as Principal of Cranfield University. From 51 to, I think, 54, he was Principal of the Cranfield there. And then he was also the Chief of the Air Staff of the Royal New Zealand Air Force. But it was his second career that perhaps the general public know him for more than the first part of his career. And that was his interest in the paranormal. And you actually, if you Google Victor Goddard paranormal, lots of things will come up, including this next picture that was taken at a disbandment of a squadron at the Royal Naval Air Service in Cranwell. Now, of course, RAF Cranwell, but then still at the Naval Air Station. And it was of the squadron disbanding in 1918. A mechanic, a few days prior to the photograph being taken, had started an engine and had walked backwards without thinking into the spinning propellers of another aircraft. Killed instantly, of course. And on the morning of the photograph, the squadron had just come back from his funeral, and it was a fairly somber occasion. And they lined up for the photograph. And this is the photograph. On the back row, which is highlighted there, you can see a face. And that face is Freddie Jackson. And all his colleagues in the squadron recognised him. That was not the only occasion. He had a famous slip through time. In 1936, he flew in a Hawker Hart biplane up to Turnhouse, but he wanted to go to RAF Drem. RAF Drem was closer to the golf course where he wanted to play with some friends. In those days, you could take an aircraft and just go up privately and do a little bit of R&R. But he didn't know whether Drem, which had been decommissioned some years previously, still had a serviceable runway. So he went to Turnhouse and decided to visit Drem in case he decided to go and play golf again in the future. He went to it and it was overcrowded, the runway was full of grass, between the cracks of the paving stones. The hangars were in disrepair, sheep were grazing, barbed wire was everywhere. And so he thought, well, it's too dangerous to try and land here, I'll keep going back to Turnhouse. On his return journey, he prepped the aircraft, took off, and got into cloud. Decided to go and got lost. Decided to descend, so you can see where he was. And he saw in the distance the place he'd been to the day before, Drem. So he thought, right, well, I'll make for Drem, because I'll know where I am now. I'll set my compass from Drem, and I will head back down to Andover. He got caught in strange coloured clouds just as he was approaching Drem. Rain lashed at him. He had to go lower. He had to go so low that a woman pushing a pram on the boundary road ducked. And he, at that point, suddenly the airfield was lit up in a bright light. And before him was a working airfield. There were yellow monoplanes. RAF had no yellow monoplanes in 1936. The engineers were in blue dungarees. They were brown in they were in brown uniform. They were blue in 1936. And he flew over the hangars, by now completely repaired, and just missed them. Nobody looked up at him. He then went past the fourth hangar, back into cloud, reached 20,000 feet, where the air was very thin, then had to descend in some clear air, where he could then get his bearings back to Andover. He reported to his CO what he'd seen, and the CO merely said to him, "Don't drink any whiskey next time you fly." Google Goddard slip through time. But perhaps his most famous paranormal experience was this one. In 1946, I want to say, 1947 maybe? No. It was no, I haven't got it down here. I think it was 1947. And he wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post in 1951 about attending a party, a cocktail party. And he was an Air Chief Marshal then, and it was the cocktail party honouring his posting back to UK. And he arrived, and as he arrived, the commander of the HMS Black Prince, by the name of Captain Gladstone, he heard Captain Gladstone behind his back saying, "Isn't it such a shame about the Air Marshal? He should die in a plane crash at such a late stage." And the Air Marshal turned around and said, "I'm sorry, young man, I'm still very much alive." Gladstone was completely confused and said, "Well, it must have been a dream, but I saw you die. I saw you die because you were in a Dakota. You were with a number of passengers, and they were, let's say, 4 men, 3 girls, and you were on your way to a meeting before going back to the UK." And he said, "Well, I am going, but we're in a Liberator. I'll tell you what, I will play you the trailer from the film. I've got the trailer from the film the night my number came up, based on a true story." Now, the producers altered some of the plot lines. They altered it to Hong Kong, for instance, and those of you who've been to Hong Kong and the old airport Kai Tak, enjoy the picture of Kai Tak, because you won't recognise it. So they altered, and they added more people so that more stars could take part in it. But it is an extraordinary 1950s film where Sir Michael Redgrave plays my great-uncle.
Only a dream. Yet it had been so vivid. I had even recognized the faces of my friends among the terrified, ill-fated passengers. The following night I dined with some of them and told them of the dream.
And you say I was in it?
Yes.
And it was a twin-engine plane, a Dakota.
Yes, that's right.
All I can say is I'm glad we're going in a Liberator, not a Dakota. But we are going in a Dakota.
On that first strange coincidence, the pieces of that nightmare dream began to fit a terrifying pattern of reality. In some uncanny way, the shape of things to come grew frighteningly clear. For we were in Hong Kong, and in the East, the powers of superstition and presentiment are strong.
This is terrifying. It's frightening, just like the dream said.
What dream?
Oh, don't you know? It's most uncanny. There was a man in Hong Kong who had a most extraordinary dream.
Please stop it. You realize that every detail has come true, that only one remains, and that one will come true, as sure as fate, unless you stop it now.
I shall do what I consider right.
Then you'll be the only lucky one, because you won't be alive to know the appalling thing you've done.
There was no change of plan, no loophole or reprieve at the 11th hour. And as those 13 went aboard the plane, each detail in the dream was finally complete. They taxied down the runway,
High tack.
took off. Their destination, Tokyo. Their chances of survival, who could tell?
Oh, come on, they don't make films like that anymore. So we go on to my maternal great-grandfather. Yes, my great-grandfather, who joined the Royal Air Force at the age of 66. But he joined because he had a singular experience. He could fly autogyros. He'd learnt, because he was a huge supporter of Juan de la Tierra, who had invented the autogyro in the early 20s. And my great-grandfather learnt to fly. So in the Second World War, there was the new secret invention of radar. And these radar sets needed calibrating. So to avoid taking frontline airmen and fighter pilots away from their duties, people like my grandfather joined. He was a flight lieutenant, joined up and was tasked with flying at a place they knew and could calibrate their radar sets. And they gave him an Air Force Cross at the end of his service, when he was demobbed. To my father now. So this is my father. He was in 604 Squadron, too late for the Battle of Britain, probably fortuitously. Too late for the Battle of Britain. He flew eventually in 604 Squadron and Mosquitoes. He trained in Canada on twins, and for the first and only time in his life, he appealed to his father not to send him to bomber command. He wanted fighter command like his father and brother before him. He was in Fighter Interception Unit. When he rested, he elected to join Fighter Interception Unit, which was also at Middle Wallop and then subsequently forward. He was therefore at the forefront of what I like to call, and probably is, AWACS, what we call AWACS now. So he went up with AI sets, what? Yes, I keep getting artificial intelligence and airborne interception radar sets. And they captured an ME-410 with the German equivalent. And they needed to find out at what stage the Germans were with their radars. So they tasked my father with flying the ME-410 in 1944 over Hampshire and Kent, but gave him 2 Mosquitoes as accompanying aircraft and painted the 410 in RAF colours in the hope that the Home Defence Volunteer Force would not take pot shots at him, having learnt their aircraft recognition pictures. And rather thrillingly, there is a picture of him actually flying it. So my father is in the front of the 410 with his navigator behind him, McRae, and he always said there was a fault with the 410, and that was the dive planes sometimes did not retract, and you could see them there on the wing, above and below, and also the rear undercarriage did not retract sometimes. And he said it was a good aircraft though, apart from those. Being my father, he wrote on the back who flew what, who was where, and details of where he flew it from, which was here at Farnborough. Collection from Farnborough, he says. Rather sadly, the crew in the Mosquito in the background were shot down and killed 2 weeks later. This is a shot of my father sitting in a clipped-wing Spitfire, which was designed to give greater roll ability, a slightly higher level of speed. Extraordinary to think he went from learning to fly on a Tiger Moth and Anson's, ending his days in the RAF in a Hawker Hunter. But we now go to his brother, my uncle, Peter Howard-Williams, one of the few, in the Battle of Britain throughout in 19 Squadron and into the thick of battle. But let's hear him and my father discussing Peter's initial posting to Duxford and his welcome there. My father is the first one to talking to Peter, and this is where they spell the words that the Americans might not know.
And Peter, you were posted right early on in the war to No. 19 Squadron, I believe, is that right? Yes, that's right. I was posted the day of the commission, which was the 7th of March. And I arrived... 1940, yes. And I arrived at Royal Air Force Station, Duxford, DUXFORD. And to join 19 Squadron, which was the first squadron to be equipped with Spitfires. Older than it. They'd had the Spitfires for a couple of years, and all, with few exceptions, had a lot of experience. The other new pilot who had arrived just before I did was Douglas Barlow, because he'd come back into the Air Force. Joined 19 Squadron, because the commanding officer of 19 Squadron, Squadron Leader Stevenson, had been a crammer with Douglas and had asked for him to join 19 Squadron. Now, just to put the story back a bit, Barlow, of course, was the chap who, before the war, stunting and rather stupidly low flying, I think it was the Bulldog, crashed and lost both his legs, didn't he? Yes, and then he was invalided out, but managed to fight his way back into the service and then flew with 2 tickets. Quite right, yes, that's right, yes. And a BADER, of course, that it was. And it was amazing to see him, and when somebody first told me in the mess, the man sitting over there had no legs, I didn't believe it, I think that did help me was that there were several ex-Cramble, CRAMWELL, ex-Cramble cadets at Duxford with 19 Squadron, notably John Petrie and Michael Lyne. And Michael Lyne had been a cadet with me. So I did get a good reception that first night in the mess. But the problem was that all the other officers had a lot of experience in flying Spitfires, and George Unwin, who was a sergeant pilot in the squadron, that's a non-commissioned officer, was the first non-commissioned officer to fly a Spitfire, and he lives within 5 hours of where I'm leaving now in 1991. In April 1991. He later on became a very highly decorated officer, earning about 4 or 5 very high gallantry awards. Now, you were swept up in the Battle of Britain fairly early, weren't you, of course, in 19? Yes. We stayed us all the time. There was none of this moving about. No, we went down to Hornchurch for the evacuation from Dunkirk. Oh, yes, of course.
So the RAF were at Dunkirk, and some of you will know the story of why the army wondered where the RAF were. They were there. From 19 Squadron, he was posted to 118 at Filton. Then the squadron went to Ibsley. Ibsley was the place where the only film allowed by Churchill to be made on an aircraft, on an airfield base, was shot. And the result was the film, the first of the few. For those who don't know, the film is told in flashback by David Niven, who is, in the clip we're about to see, the only actor in the film. The rest of them were all in the Battle of Britain, either pilots or ground crew. And it tells the story of the design, build, and first flight of course, R.J. Mitchell's Spitfire. He wasn't to see, of course, Mitchell wasn't to see the production of the Spitfire at Southampton until because it was after his death. Leslie Howard played R.J. Mitchell, and David Niven played the role, which was a composite of the 2 test pilots, Mutt Summers and Geoffrey Quill, and they called him Geoffrey Crisp. 8 airmen were real Battle of Britain veterans, stationed at Ibsley in either 118 or 501 squadrons. And my Uncle Peter was one of them. The story goes that they were still an active base, and if the bell went to scramble, they stopped filming and went off, fought the war and came back and carried on as if nothing had happened. David Niven was so impressed with this that he sent, at the end of filming at the RAF, he sent the men to the Savoy Hotel for the weekend. And he rang up the general manager and he said, I'm sending you 8 airmen. Whatever they want, give it to them and send me the bill. Difficult to think of any of our stars doing that now. I have a brief clip from the film, which I stop at one point so I can point out my uncle to you. But it's a lot of Spitfire flying, which is rather lovely.
Got an idea, how to crack the door. Good, Georgia, that's great. See that job? Absolutely head on. I bet that's super. Very sure you do. Hello, Mark, have any luck? Yes, I got a 110 from down the flame and flew up. Try luck like this, you all, while you're on it. You finish them off, Willie. I like that. Oh, okay, I'll let you know, Mark. Will you do on your story? Following?
The one on the right is my uncle.
Get off my ankle, I suppose that counts. Your ankle? All right, our ankle. Anybody seen the seal? I don't think he's arrived yet, sir. Is there anybody else on here? Well, I think I saw Red 2 go down. Must have been Titch. That Titch is all right. He's my Red 3. One on the petrol tank. Here's the seal coming in now. Who's what's going on with it? He hasn't got his bets down. He'll overshoot. You all right? Are you all right? Come on, hurry up! what I want an airplane, not an ambulance. There are hundreds of them up there, and probably more coming.
Extraordinary to think they were all Battle of Britain veterans, except David Niven, the only one who wasn't. So we have two relatives by marriage now. We go to my uncle, Group Captain Peter Helmover, who was married to my aunt, and his father, Air Commodore William Helmover. He, the father, was the inventor of the Helmover Torpedo. I guess a lot of you will know more about this than I do. And of course he did the Turbinlight searchlight. But he was a reporter, and he was the first live report of the D-Day landings. And when I say live, he was in a Liberator talking into a microphone, and they got back to Northolt, and the film was then sent to the BBC, where it was done as a live recording. Wasn't actually live from overhead. His son, Peter Helmover, by the way, I knew all these people well, apart from the father, Bill Helmover. I don't think I ever met him. Peter I knew well. He had the most amount of pathfinder operations in the Second World War, 102. And that was to eventually catch up with him. What we now know today as PTSD caught up with him just after he'd been appointed station commander at Scampton. And he had that taken away from him as a result of his wartime experience. And he was sent as air attaché to Turkey, Istanbul. Sailing his boat out there, he was in the middle of the Bay of Biscay when an oil tanker without a working radar ran him down in the middle of the night. And they just saw the mast scraping down the side, and by the time they turned round and went back, there was no trace of my uncle or the boat. It is extraordinary how, with the death of my uncle in service, the others having retired, no one from my generation joined the Royal Air Force. And to show you how extraordinary it is, this is them. So my uncle's at the top, as the eldest. He was married 4 times. He was a wicked uncle. He once advised me when I first moved to London, when I was going to have children, and if I didn't want to change their nappies and in those days they had, reusable nappies, he said, all you do, dear boy, is you change it once, give it a little jab with a safety pin, you'll never be asked to change it again. Of course, he didn't mean it. At least I like to think he didn't. My father, who was married to my mother twice, I went to the second wedding. He had 3 children, my uncle had 4, and my uncle, we got 2 first cousins, Richard and Annabelle. None of us went into the service. So, again, the more astute of you makes 8 pilots. Now this is the bit at least one of you in this room is not going to enjoy very much. So we go to my son, our son, Dominic Howard-Williams. He's not going to enjoy it because he's sitting at the back right now and he's not really heard this before. Whilst he we took him up to Cranwell in 2017 or 16 or 18 or whenever it was, and we saw the medals in the library of my uncle's medals, Battle of Britain pilot, which his 4th wife had given to Cranwell without asking any of his children. They were a little upset. But we bought Dominic a Red Arrow suit at Biggin, and he knew at the age of 6, and he knew from then on what he was going to do. So this is him on the left. There he is, yep. Didn't enjoy that, I knew he wouldn't. As an air cadet. And at Cranwell in the middle with some of his awards, and at Shawbury on the right, he elected to go rotary. And this is what he now flies out of RAF Odium. So let's see him in training. This is him flying a squirrel up the Wye Valley. And I show this because I thought he was low enough. But there is a point where you can see his instructor, who's sitting in the left seat. The captains of helicopters sit in the right, whereas, of course, in fixed wing, it's on the left. So he's sitting in, and you can see him just go lower, lower. And I think, nah. I think that's low enough. I think it's when we come back, is it? Watch the instructor. Down. No, this is nothing yet. Sometimes wonder whether he knew. Do you know you had rotors, blades going around on top of it? It's quite low, I think. Now, at this point, my wife will kill me if I don't mention this. She had to suffer me writing my autobiography, which is all about my life in music. But the first part of it is about these men. I do it in acts, and there are about 7 acts rather than chapters. And the first act is all about my ancestors and then about my subsequent career, which has been quite interesting and stretches from the 2 Ronnies to, and I'm still a working conductor. And on the left is my father's book. I had a call out of the blue. They would like to republish my father's book that he wrote in 1976. This has now, it's only been in ebook, and it's been out since for about 4 months. My book has been out 6 months. It's outsold me thousands to 1, and quite right too. It's a wonderful story of AWACS and his time in the Royal Air Force. So to finish, and I'll do some questions if you've got any afterwards. My father had a picture which he inherited from his father. And you can see it there, the picture is there, and it's of my grandfather, my father on the left, his brother in the middle, and the CO of 25 Squadron. And the picture is of their grandfather attacking RAF Hendon at the 1922 air pageant, when it wasn't a museum. And he was leading 25 Squadron because my grandfather was CO, wing commander, wing leader or something. He was the leader of the snipes, dummy attacking the tanks. And before they died, my father said, we'd like to give this picture to 25 Squadron. And he said to me, does anybody have any objection? Do your brother, sister, do you think anybody has any objection? And we got together and we said, no, the perfect place to hang this picture is on the wall behind the desk, which is where he said he was going to put it, of 25 Squadron. So it was duly handed over. Fast forward to 2010, I think, and the naming ceremony of the Queen Elizabeth or the Queen Victoria, one of the Cunard ships, which I'd just conducted. And we were talking at the reception to the Kaz at the time, who was Sir Stephen Dalton. And I said how proud I was that there was a picture of my grandfather attacking RAF Hendon in 1922 behind the desk of 25 Squadron's commanding officer. And he said, and he shuffled his feet a bit. And I said, why? He said, well, we've disbanded 25 Squadron. And I said, well, that's very interesting, because we had made it a condition of the handover that if 25 Squadron was to be disbanded or didn't want the picture for any reason, it was to be handed back to the family. And the agreement was written and put on the back of the painting. So he said, let me investigate. 6 weeks later, a staff car draws up outside my house in Kingston. And Wing Commander gets out of it with the painting. And I said, where did you find that? They said, it was in the garage being looked after by one of the officers of 25 Squadron. And I looked on the back, and there was the agreement still stapled to the back of the painting. It now hangs in our front hall, in pride of place, I have to say. So I have this photograph because up on here, because my father always got the last word. He always got the last word. And he did what I did. He went round giving talks about the Spitfire, and the Mosquito, and his experience of the Second World War, and radar, and flying at night, and all sorts of things like that. And actually, in early 2000s, I did this lecture on board the QE2 on the ship. And with a shiver of pleasure, I suddenly realised my father had stood in the same spot 20 years previously and given a similar lecture to the one I was now giving. But he always finished his talks with what I'm going to finish mine with now. So I finish mine the same way as my father finished his.
Well, it's coming towards the end of my paper, and before I sum up, I should acknowledge the help of my elder brother, who was a Spitfire pilot in 1942. He also survived the war, and I used to bounce ideas off him, and much later he retired with his wife to Spain. When I was preparing this paper, my wife and I went to visit them, so I could get his reaction by giving me the night fighter, the day fighter idea. We were reminiscing on one of the topless beaches they have up there, when he turned to me and he said, "Do you remember that stuff they used to put in our tea?" "Yes," I replied. "Bromide, wasn't it? Designed to take away some of our biological urges. Why do you ask?" "Well," he said, slowly surveying the mounds of flesh all round us, shaking his old grey head rather sadly, "I think it's beginning to work."
Thank you very much.